In this video, we're going to talk about Bible translation. And this throws people off a lot. And so I don't want you to be thrown off by it. So we really want to talk about what is the idea of translation. Because people will say, well, why are there so many different Bibles? Or why are there so many different, version of the Bible, or which one is the right one, or which one should I do? Or if you're not even familiar and you're going, wait, there's different versions of the Bible. It's different translations. So remember, the Bible was originally written in Hebrew and Greek. Some portions, again, of the Old Testament are written in a language called Aramaic, which is close to Hebrew. You don't really need to know that. The Bible was written not in English, okay? And not in French, and not in Spanish, and not in Latin, and it's written in Hebrew and Greek. And so we want to translate it to people so that they can read it. When you translate something, you can translate it in different ways. So I have here for you just a picture. I just wanted you to see. So sometimes the idea of Hebrew and Greek are so, literally foreign to us that we don't know what that would look like. And so I have here just an image of what a text would look like in Hebrew and what would look like there in Greek. And so what happens is Bible translators, Bible scholars study ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek really, 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 really thoroughly. And every single time that they make a translation, they go back to the Hebrew, back to the Greek, and go, okay, how would we translate this then into a new language? So, if it's missionaries translating the Bible into a language that has never had the Bible, they're working with Hebrew and Greek scholars to be able to translate that into their language. When we translate it, you can translate, as I said, you can translate something a couple different ways usually. If you speak more than one language, this makes perfect sense to you. There are things that there are things that in the original language, maybe it means a few different things. And so you kind of go, well, what's the closest to the way we would explain it in our culture? It might be a subtle idea. It might be that there's a lot to this word. It might be that it meant something really specific then. And so scholars work very hard to translate then into our language. So there are several English translations of the Bible. None of them is the wrong translation, okay? There are several English translations because there might be a few different ways you could say this in English. And so over the years, different groups and organizations have said, okay, let's make a translation that's maybe a little more modern. So for a long time, the English translations were really old. They were from the, late 15, early 1600s, when people just spoke differently than we speak today. And so eventually they would make translations that were a little more up to date, and we continue to do that because our English changes. The Greek and Hebrew of the Bible never changes. It's there, it's set, but our English changes, and so we make updated translations sometimes to go, okay, how do we explain this now today? Let me give you an example. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, in their mindset, the kidneys were a way to express a core part of you, okay? Your kidneys. Now, you and I would never say that. We would say, I love you with all my heart. We'd never say, I love you with my kidneys, right? We don't talk about kidneys. It'd be weird. But in their mindset, that made sense. Similar to us saying, like, I felt it in my gut. Really? You felt it in your guts, in your stomach? Maybe, but but that makes sense in the way that we talk. Now, if I mean the same thing, if I know that what they meant in the Old Testament by my kidneys meant really the core and the inner part of me, then what I need to do in English when I translate is go, well, what do we mean in our culture, the core and inner part? Ah, your heart. Now, if I go to the older English translation, you'll see in there, you would see instead of heart sometimes the word reins, R-E-I-N-S, and you're like, reins? I'm not a horse, I don't have reins, what does this mean? That was the word for kidneys they used at that time in history in the English language. You and I do not call our kidneys our reins, okay? So they were taking the word kidneys in Hebrew and translating it into what they called your reins. And then later people said, yeah, but we don't, what kidneys meant in the first culture of the Bible was really the inner part of you and your emotions. So now we mean heart, so let's say heart, okay? Now we can go back to the Hebrew. By the way, sometimes Hebrew does use the word heart, but sometimes it uses kidneys, and go, okay, here's where it says kidneys. So we haven't corrupted or changed or edited anything in that Hebrew version. We haven't corrupted, changed, or edited anything in that Greek New Testament. We're just translating it differently so that it makes sense to people today. So I hope that makes sense. Again, you can translate something sometimes a little bit differently depending on how you want to put it, because the idea in this language might mean this. How do we translate it into English? And so as a result, you can get different English translations. Now, those translations, they kind of operate on a spectrum. Some are more, we call it literal or word for word, and some are more figurative, or we call it a paraphrase. Or sometimes we say thought for thought. So the idea is that there are some translations where the scholars have done their very best to, as closely as possible, get the English version of what's being said there in Greek or Hebrew. In other ones, they've gotten a little looser, and they're trying to give you less the word and more of the meaning in Greek and Hebrew, more of the cultural meaning. And so they might use more words than are there in Hebrew to express this idea. Maybe fewer words than are there in Greek to express an idea. So it's more about translating the idea, and that can be a little looser. But those operate on a spectrum. Examples of more literal translations would be the New King James Version, the New American Standard, and the English Standard. We use abbreviation or what are those called? Whatever those letters are called. Can't think of it right now, but acronyms. We use acronyms for these. So instead of saying New King James Version, we might say NKJV. We might write it that way. Instead of English Standard Version, we can write ESV. That's the version, by the way. The ESV is the one that we use here in church when we teach. And that's one that I really like and would recommend to you. But I'm going to give you another recommendation as well. Examples of more paraphrased, a little more loose, often a little more easy to read translations would be the New International Version, or the NIV, and the New Living Translation, or the NLT. And so those, I'm going to give you here an example. So I want you to see this and see that essentially you're looking at the same thing, the same idea, but it's going to be said in slightly different ways. And I'm going to go from a more literal to a more kind of thought for thought paraphrase translation here. This is John 1:10, so Book of John, chapter 1, verse 10 of that chapter, John 1:10. And I want you to hear and see how this is essentially the same, but slightly different as we go. So ESV. Now don't get hung up on what the meaning of this verse is. I just want you to hear the words, okay? Don't go, well, what does that all mean? Don't go there yet. Just hear the way it's translated, okay? He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. Okay, NIV. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. King James Version. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. All right, all kind of similar, slightly different, right? The ESV said know him, NIV said recognize, so does it mean they didn't know him like they'd never met him? No. Does it mean they didn't know him like, what does that mean? Well, they didn't recognize who he really was. We mean that by no. And so NIV has chosen to use recognize. King James Version, he was in the world, I read that one. NLT, He came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. A little looser, but there to give us the concept, right? And then the message is what's more of a real paraphrase. So it's not trying to be at all a word-for-word translation. It's trying to paraphrase it in the language you and I would use every day. And that one says, he was in the world was there through him, and yet the world didn't even notice, okay? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which Bible translation you use, okay? So a lot of newer people to the Bible get really hung up on which one's the right one. There's not a right one. It doesn't really matter. But I'm going to give you two recommendations, okay? If you are more comfortable with reading the Bible and you want to read it a little more tight and close to the original language, I'm going to recommend getting an ESV Bible. We'll give you one for free. We use it here when we teach. It's readable, but sometimes even just reading the Bible can be a challenge. If you're really, really struggling and you really want, Andrew, is there an easier version? I recommend the New Living Translation. The New Living Translation, in my opinion, is my best recommendation on one that's really close to what that original language is saying, but staying really readable. I don't recommend, so the message is very readable because it's a paraphrase, but I don't recommend using that as your everyday go-to Bible that you would read. If you're struggling, New Living Translation. If you're okay for a little more of the deep end, the ESV, and that would be my recommendation. So that's how Bible translation works. It's not as scary as it sounds. The point is, get a Bible and start reading it.